So has anybody in here ever locked their keys in their car? I almost hate to say this because I've only done it one time, and I'm afraid if I say that out loud that like this week I'll probably lock my keys in the car somehow. But I did it one time, and fortunately I actually locked my keys in the car when I was at a gas station service station. And if I remember right, my car was even running when I did it. But I remember that moment of just fear and dread and wondering, what in the world am I going to do? But I guess if you're going to lock your keys in your car, that's the place to do it, because they were able to get it open for me. Then I was also thinking about this story with locked rooms and locked doors. And my last winter when I lived in South Dakota, we had a blizzard where the snow drifted completely over the rooftops. And it never dawned on me until that morning that both my front and back doors opened out. And so I was locked inside. I was trapped inside and couldn't get the doors pushed because there was snow all the way up to the rooftops. And this was before everyone had cell phones, and out the window I could see that all of my neighbors were out shoveling and snow blowing, but I couldn't get in contact with any of them. So my dog and I had to dig our way out through the dog door and tunnel our way through and up until we could finally see some light. But I'm wondering, have you ever met someone who has felt like they are locked in? We probably don't have to look very far, especially in this room, to find someone who's felt that kind of agony. Have you ever been locked in by fear? Well, there's a writer who describes what it's like to be locked in by that prison of fear. And she says that fear is a physiological response to tomorrow. It is almost always about death. And fear causes us to live in a perpetual state of anxiety. And it is exhausting and depressing. And generally, the calamities that we expect do not come to pass, so then we just replace them with new ones. And that time and energy that could be used constructively for things like prayer or even washing the dishes, learning something new, we sacrifice that to cultivate more apprehension. And sometimes I wonder if we have more faith in our fears than we do in our relationship with the God of our understanding. And then too, when someone or something has been locked in, that also means that someone else has to be locked out. So have you ever been locked out? It's a helpless feeling, being locked out. And locked out is how we feel when someone we love is trapped in the bondage of addiction. And locked in is how we feel when we are the one who is trapped in that bondage of addiction. Locked out is how we feel when we want to help someone but can't seem to break through. And locked in is how we feel when it seems like we just can't figure out how to get out of the trap we're stuck in. Locked in is how we feel when we are filled with guilt and self-loathing and are unable to forgive ourselves. And locked out is how we feel when we can't convince someone that they are forgiven and that we love them. And our reading today begins behind locked doors, but also with the disciples locked in due to their fear. And it's understandable that they are afraid because their world has been turned upside down. And I'm sure they were afraid for their own lives, but also what they were going to do next with their lives. But there are no walls thick enough to block the entry of God, to block the entry of God into that inner sanctum, that safe room that the disciples had created at the center of their fears. And the same is true for us. We can experience a spiritual awakening in our own lives that lets us know that we don't have to live in fear. When we've lived in fear, there is, of course, doubt. But I also think that doubt is a companion to faith. It's not the opposite. And doubt tends to creep into all sorts of people. But sometimes I think with some healthy moderation, doubt is okay to have. Because doubt tests our faith. And doubt tempers our fear. And doubt makes our faith stronger. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. And I think it's an important notion for us to understand, especially those in early recovery who are struggling to find and develop their own spiritual understanding and connection. Doubt is what sometimes keeps people from being seekers and asking their questions or their wonderings. But this is exactly the place where doubt needs to be brought. And doubt should be brought right up to the forefront, along with all of our declarations and our statements of confidence. We should bring our doubts to our communities of faith, to our support systems, to this fellowship. And those of us who are hearing and listening to those doubts, we should bless them. We should bless those doubts. And not necessarily in some liturgical sense, but our doubt should be blessed through the engagement of the whole community. We work through them together, and we acknowledge and support one another through our doubts. And I think that this is one of the things our reading is teaching us today. The story is not only about Thomas's doubt or Thomas's faith. It is a story about this group of people, this community and fellowship, bringing others back into a relationship with themselves and with God. Even though Thomas was gone, the disciples bring him back deeply into their fold. Even when he questioned and had his doubts, they bring him back into their fold. And that is when he encountered God. It was then that he no longer needed to touch to believe because the presence was real. Not only in the corporal reality of God's presence, but also in the living body of the assembly gathered, the people that were gathered there to support him. And their mission, this community that had been living together for so long, their mission was to restore unity with one another and with God. So if the opposite of faith isn't doubt, then what would we see as the opposite of faith? I think there's several ideas, but two come to mind. The first being fear, and fear can destroy us. And the second opposite is certainty, because faith is alive. Faith is organic, it's alive, and it's growing. It wrestles around and it grows stronger, even while being tested. But certainty is cold and solid. Certainty is unchanging, inorganic, and unmalleable. And certainty can lead to types of manufactured truths, that truth with the little t, and that can actually lead to destruction of faith. But there are three gifts that I think we can find in our reading this morning, that three gifts that were brought to the disciples, and those same gifts are available to all of us. The first gift is the gift of peace. We seek out peace and serenity when we start to learn how to apply the serenity prayer into our lives. What is in my control to change, and what is out of my control? Because oftentimes our fear is based on trying to change those things that are out of our control, and we just keep spinning our wheels, trying to change and trying to change and trying to change those things that are not ours to change. And I think sometimes when we experience worldly peace, which is that experience of feeling like everything is going our way, then we expect it to always be that way. And then the world disappoints us because we don't get to maintain that, because that's just not the way the world works. And then we become frustrated and aggravated. There was one writer that I was reading this week that was talking about that gift of peace. And she writes that she grew up in a home full of turmoil. It was unstable and filled with alcohol, anger, and all kinds of abuse. But she went on to say, I learned that I had to take responsibility for my actions in my life, or my life would never be different than what I experienced throughout my childhood. And I remember when I realized that living with frustration, aggravation, and worry really just did me no good at all. And all I ever got from this way of being was a headache, a backache, and a grouchy attitude. As I began to take responsibility and say, God will help me to do something about this if I really want God's help, then things began to change. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But as I trusted God more and more to help me, then I made the right decisions, and I learned to live with God's peace. The second gift that is offered is purpose. God's peace is not a passive contentment. It's a mission. It's a sense of purpose. And we know this from our 12th step, to go out and help other alcoholics and addicts, to be of service, to be sent out into the world, to be the hands and feet of God, and to care for God's beloved. And the third gift is the gift of power. When we build a relationship with God, our tired and wearied bodies and spirits can find life and find a new, revitalized life. Because when God comes with this peace and presence, purpose and power, it can break through the tightest walls that we have built. When people are locked in grief, and when they're locked in fear and locked in darkness, it is God's peace and purpose and power that can free people from that kind of bondage. And for us here today, we are called to leave the rooms we've locked ourselves in and to go out and to be emboldened by the knowledge that we bear that peace and purpose and power of God to be of service to others. As God's people and as people in this fellowship, we bring all that separates us, be it doubt or certainty or fear, and we bring that to God and ask that it be blessed. And when we ask for it to be blessed, then it can be transformed into that yearning for what on a deeper level we know to be true. And that's true with a capital T. And what we know to be true is that with Thomas and with all the other disciples and with all of those who have gone before us, that when we stand together and when each and every time we recognize and believe God's love for us and God's love in one another,